Okay, welcome everybody to the final session of today's event, Developing Socially Productive Places. Just for those of you who weren't here earlier on, I'm Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the RSA. Now, we've got 4 speakers, all of whom have got to deal with the fact they've only been given 5 minutes to talk about what they've heard this afternoon and what they've found interesting. When they've all spoken for 5 minutes, I'm then going to do something really unpleasant to you all. Don't worry. It's at the level of ideas, but it'll just be an interesting provocation I'm going to give you. But I won't tell you what it is until you've spoken. And then I'm going to open up to the room, and I will finish, no later than about 4:45. So, okay. The 4 people we're going to hear from are, first of all, Richard Blyth, who's Head of Policy and Practice at the Royal Town Planning Institute. We're then going to hear from Alison Seabrooke, Chief Executive of Community Development Foundation, Adrian Penfold, Head of Planning and Corporate Responsibility at British Land, and Christine Townley, Executive Director of Construction Youth Trust. So I'm going to stand here at the lectern to make sure you don't go beyond your 5 minutes, because I've found that if I stand at the lectern, people stick to their timing. It's a beautiful clock, isn't it? Absolutely. Okay, Richard, over to you.
Well, I work for the Royal Town Planning Institute. I suppose in terms of today, 2 things are particularly important for us. One is the issue about the skills needed to deliver the places that we want to have in the future. And the other thing that's particularly important to me, I suppose, is what is the policy environment in which people exercising those skills can operate in. So Mark Prisk said, I doubt we have the skills in local planning authorities to do this. This is something I hear almost every week. The Farrell Review came out and said, I doubt we have the skills to do this in local authorities. I've had rather too much of this kind of talk. Resources in local... Resources
I got a guttural cry from planners.
Resources for local planning in local authorities are down 40%, the most cut service of any in local government. And the relentless denigration of planning in the public sector, not only in this government, but in preceding ones, just continues. This is not the way in which you attract the best brains into the profession on leaving school. On the other hand, I sat through an amazing presentation by Wahid Nazir about what planning is doing in Birmingham. Wahid said planners lead the agenda in Birmingham. Significantly and no accident, the education portfolio is under the control of the Director of Planning and Regeneration. He was just saying, investment interest from MIPIM. He's kick-started a housing market in a part of Birmingham where no housing market existed, and now the private sector is climbing over themselves to get in there. So there's an issue here that planning isn't about market failure correction and regulation, and yet this is the dominant paradigm. This is what the people who work in the Treasury continue to whisper into ministers' ears, and this is what we're told always: planning must get out of the way. And yet we've seen that you can create something. You don't have to just go on being a regulator, someone who's doing no wrong. We want to see more right done rather than just not wrong done. The other thing we looked at, I was in a session with Jonathan Portis on city regions, and here there was a whole question about how does a city region work together, and Jonathan made the key issue about higher education institutions need to be strong players on behalf of their city regions, not working against them. And I think I would add into that the whole question of the way which acute hospitals and foundation trusts work. Are they really working on behalf of the cities in which they are as centres of excellence and major employers and key traffic generators? And it leads on to a final question for me about decentralisation, because we've been hearing that when it works because cities are set free. And what he was pointing out, that the Department for Education will not let him use a playing field for any purpose other than education unless a period of 2.5 to 3 years has elapsed before it's possible. And yet, this is situations where we're talking about community consensus for the reuse of land for other purposes that the community wants to bring about. So there's a question really for me, about skills. How do we get the best people into the built environment professions and the professions working for our cities, not by slagging them off? And secondly, how do we get cities to really achieve their highest performance by setting them free?
Thank you, Richard. Actually, panel, to be entirely fair to you, I'm going to tell you what the task is, so to take you out of your misery. I'm going to ask you at the end, each of you, to tell me one thing that you've heard from somebody else that you really agree with and is a really good point, or that you've heard this afternoon. But I also want you to say one thing you've heard which you're not sure about, or that you disagree with, or you disagree with passionately. So think about things you've not agreed with that you've heard, so it's not an entirely bland consensus. I'm sure it won't be. Okay, so Alison Seabrooke.
Okay. Right, so I think the thing that I heard that was a recurrent theme throughout the whole of the sessions was that socially productive places are largely driven by employment, which drives general well-being, and of course employment is fueled by development. That's a very loose interpretation, of course. And this actually probably answers your question, Matthew. So what I heard and what I avidly believe is actually that they're usually two sides of the same coin, and there's more that actually unites what developers, planners and so on want to do and what communities want to be involved in and receive than there is that divides them. So I started to draw a little diagram. I said developers and planners looking at economic development, land value, GDP. They want a good public realm, infrastructure, housing, businesses, quality of place, and they need workers and skills to drive that, to achieve that. Communities need financial and social well-being. They need jobs and housing to achieve that, and skills, obviously, to be able to be fully engaged in the employment market. And, of course, they want a fantastic quality of place. So more that unites people than divides them. So when I heard that earlier on, I just thought, yes, that's my experience at Community Development Foundation. We just look at this through a different lens. British Land Trust and Regent's Place was a perfect example of this, and Chris Grigg developed a set of skills and is integrating that into all his work. I think that is something about an industry benchmark. There was also a unifying theme around the value of relationships. Ed Watson picked that up.
Just say, look, because that's a sort of provocative thing. So, what do you mean by a new industry benchmark?
That,
do you mean that concretely, that there ought to be a new industry benchmark?
Yes, there ought to be, because I'm a firm believer that community development, and it has been mentioned by people, it became a bit unsexy a few years ago, but I'm a firm believer that it isn't it isn't owned by a particular set of people. It's a way of doing things which evaluates different perspectives and finds a common ground and a path. It doesn't mean about agreeing with everything. So I think the benchmark would be what British Land Trust had talked about, was being involved over a long period of time and having the time and skills to recognise what worked and what didn't. And I'll just come on to that. There is an issue around places' ability to develop when they don't fit into government plans. That was discussed. And an ability to mediate difficult positions locally, politics locally. And I would sort of contradict what you sort of alluded to earlier, Matthew, right at the start, was that is actually explicitly the same in communities. That the problems arising in communities where people turn up and it's the usual suspects and so on, is actually driven by a set of beliefs of individuals, just as we have through our professional lives as well as our personal lives. So, but if we go back to what those common interests are, then that should be a guiding principle of what we all want to achieve. What does it need? It needs time, which is again what Chris Grigg's illustrated. It needs a very particular set of personnel skills, personal and personnel skills. And Ed Watson, and talking about Camden, I sort of summed it up as he was very clear that spade work is much more than about digging footings. It is about that investment of time. If you want to talk in business terms, I actually see it as risk mitigation and management. If you don't do that effectively, then the outcomes can be more costly. We did have one provocation, which I thought was interesting, and I'm not sure if I agree with this, was our need for development. The development resources, the pressures on land values, the need for housing and so on, may actually require us to say explicitly to an area, you are going to have this, there is no dispute about it, but now we need you to come aboard and help us shape what that might look like, rather than giving an option to opt out. Again, that still needs skills to facilitate this. So what are the opportunities? Time is critical in talking about development plans, and I think the golden thread has to be for a body to be there for the long haul. And for me, that often just says it has to be the private sector for a number of reasons. You know, we might not agree with the private sector, but there are some extremely good examples of practice, as illustrated earlier. It has to be there to endure movement within communities and the political changes within the public sector. So blown with, not in the wind. And finally, my plea, which I was tweeting about earlier, whenever I'm at these events or roundtables in government and so on, people constantly talk about community in the abstract. I would say it's do unto others. What would each of us want to expect if we had this happening in our own community? And our expectations would be extremely varied. You know, it'd be built on our own personal needs. So, so if we have to think about it as what we would want as an engaged individual of a socially productive place, and also with our other hat on as an engaged deliverer and facilitator of a socially productive place.
Thank you, Alison. Adrian Penfold.
Interesting, the point on the benchmark. We've tried to use Regent's Place as a benchmark for us. I mean, the industry as a whole is quite challenging, very challenging. It's challenging enough for us. So the big question is, how do we apply some of those lessons elsewhere? We've achieved that what we've achieved at Regent's Place over 30 years, and we can't do that everywhere. We're long-term investors, long-term developers. But 30 years is an extraordinarily long time for any developer to be involved on one particular site with one particular community. In the session with Ed Watson, he talked about how do we win hearts and minds. And I guess you can encapsulate it just as that. How do we win hearts and minds? Well, not by turning up with a posse of consultants in suits, that's clear. And that's one of the comments that we got in the report, one of the learnings we got from the report. There's more to it than that. Ed also described his Mary Berry recipe. I'll leave him at some future time to give you the full details of that, those of you who weren't there. But the key one for me was that people can smell when it's not genuine, and I firmly believe that. So in our efforts to sort of benchmark and use the benchmark and apply it, in 2010 we launched our own community charter, which Anna, who's here, laboured over. She's probably not going to like what I've got to say now, but I'm going to say it nonetheless. She laboured over, and it's a terrific document, and did have a change, did have an influence on us as the way we operate and our culture. But to be honest, it's a bit tick box, and I think over the last 4 years, what we've learned is we just can't do this everywhere. It was really indicating an intention to try and do certain things everywhere. There needs to be proportionality, and there needs to be designed to fit particular circumstances. It also needs resourcing, and we now have 2 community executives in our team, our head of community, Anna, and Eleanor, who's our newly appointed community executive, fresh out of Hackney Council. It also needs a long-term strategy to develop capacity and consensus and partnership in local communities, and so that can last over time. I would suggest over different sites and over different developers, and that I think can only be done from the public sector. I mean, it's interesting. I think we may be disagreeing with each other here, but I think the public sector has to take a lead. And I was encouraged by also listening to Wahid and his vision for Birmingham, and where there is clearly a lead coming from the public sector, which others can buy into. Incentives have a role. Is SIL the right tool? I'd say no, it's not. It's not locally designed to serve local communities. Ross Houston in the session with Ed spoke about listening to local communities in designing the benefits package. SIL is hopeless at that. It also, this whole issue of community incentives, community benefits brings with it a whole range of propriety issues which need thinking about very carefully. There needs to be a policy basis, there needs to be transparency, and we did a lot of work in West Euston working with that partnership in addressing those sorts of issues. Establishing common agendas is key. How can developers, communities, local authorities, etc., all benefit from that same investment? Our experience at Regent's Place on the Euston Circus project, one of those crossings of Euston Road, the biggest one, where we worked with Camden Council, with Transport for London, with the local community. That was a good example, I think. Listening to Wahid, though, in that second session, I was really impressed, as I say, by the ownership of the vision for Birmingham by the council. That, I think, is a basis for partnership with local communities and with developers. We need to know what's important to the council, to the public authorities generally. And we also, what was also encouraging was hearing what Wahid talk about being proactive on implementation. It's not just about having a vision. Where it needed fixing, where the local authority really needed to intervene, they are doing, and I was impressed by that. Finally, one suggestion that's come out of this afternoon that I certainly intend to take away and think about and talk to other people about is why not establish a developers learning network, so that we as developers, and many of us are doing work in this area. Well, why don't we get together? I think Richard Baldwin's here from Derwent. He'd be one person that we're already talking to about some of these issues. Argent had been mentioned today. A whole range of developers who have these things as high on their agenda, and we ought to be talking to each other more.
Very good. If there's any role the RSA can play, we love networks. Thank you for that, Adrian. And then last but not least, Christine Townley.
Thank you. I'm Christine Townley. I run a charity called the Construction Youth Trust. So I beaver away most days helping young people get into construction, or at least understand the opportunities. So it's really great to have the opportunity to see the wider landscape and hear how things are moving forward. And I was really heartened with the conversations that I've heard around the interaction between British Land and Camden Council. And we work with British Land with our Budding Brunel's programme. So I know how we work with them in best practice to support young people. And I think the sharing of best practice across developers, across contractors, is vitally important. I recently was with a group of construction contractors who wouldn't even share their best practice around recruiting people because they had to keep it secret because it was part of the competition, because they may not get a contract from a client if they shared that practice. So I think sharing practice is vital if we're going to support our young people to get the skills that are needed to build the Britain of the future. And to support the supply chain, we've got some examples of companies that are already working, smart painters and decorators in the room today, who are doing fantastic work with young people, and we need to encourage that and support that and champion those companies. And I was really pleased to hear about the vision. I think there was some very interesting work, not just because I think I'm London-centric, although we work across the country. It was really good to hear what was happening in Leeds and the fact that there are other places other than London we sometimes forget. So where am I looking at? There's young people have had 5 years of no jobs. They've been 5 years to go away. We've now got to make sure that we utilise them in what we're doing in the future, and that this place that we're going to be building between us all, these spaces that we're going to be developing, that they're involved with, not just at the end, that we're doing with them, not to them. And I think that's vitally important. A statistic that came to me about construction recently was that in the last few years, the number of young people working in construction under 20 has gone down 75%. That's terrible. So we need to get them involved. We need to get them involved so that they feel part of this space that we're going to create, that they're going to get jobs from it, and that they are going to become economically viable as individuals. So skills forecasting has to happen, because if the recession's happening and our young people aren't trained, they're not going to be equipped for the jobs. So we need to work together to make sure that we've got them ready for the future. And the number of women in construction is low. It's at only 12%. Diversity is poor. If we're going to create spaces, women use those spaces as well, and they've got to be part of the development of them and of the construction of them. So I think there's some great opportunity today. I feel there's a lot of potential, but we need to remember these key facts that worry me every day, maybe not you, about supporting people. And apprenticeships are painfully low as well. So I think that's really important. What comes from me is the power of the client, hearing how British Land has worked, particularly in Regent's Place, and how the client can really make a difference and push things down the supply chain and in working with the community. And we're at the moment working with Network Rail, and a member of my staff is sitting in Crossrail, looking at how we can support the young people either side of the line between Paddington and Maidenhead to help them understand what construction is about. So I think we all have a part to play, and we must do that. And the piece that for me to go out into the communities is we need to join up Construction PLC so that young people see it as a total industry rather than a fragmented industry. Once you get in, it's, you may move around, you may move from company to company, but our young people need to know what construction's about. And in the recent Lost Generations report, one key thing was careers. Young people don't understand what the careers are. Ofsted has recommended that industry goes into schools and tells people about their careers. We've got a wealth of opportunity within this room, within the developments that we're talking about. We need to make sure our young people know about them, there's transparent routes into the sector, that industry needs to be joined up, and that planning and procurement processes, particularly from local authorities, but and from others with the procurement, needs to make sure that we embed community benefit into that process. So for me, I've really enjoyed the day. It's helped me open my mind up, and thank you very much, and I look forward to further discussions.
Thank you, Christine. Slightly changing what I said I'd do earlier, I am kind of interested in putting you on the spot panel, just saying, has there been anything in what you've heard from the other panellists or that you've heard today that still concerns you? Some part of the debate which you think isn't clear or that is going to stop us making progress? Let me start with you, Richard. Is there anything in this debate that worries you, where there's an element of it that you want to kind of challenge?
Well, it's a bit of a picky point. I mean, I agree with loads of what Mark Prisk stands for and says and has achieved, and I agree with him on some of the issues around regions, but there's one tiny point that I do have a little difficulty with, and that is the notion that local plans reflect areas that have some kind of historic and emotional connection with people. I mean, it rather depends where you happen to live, doesn't it? If you live in York, possibly, but there are some district councils in the country whose names, you know, mean very little because they're cobbled together in 1974 from abstract constructs. So I think the whole question of localism and local plans is quite complicated, and it's not just simply a question of saying, oh, it's all going to be fine if you have it operating at the lowest level of local government.
The rest of the panel, do you share Richard's kind of slight counter to a romanticised notion that the local is always clear and obvious and meaningful to people?
Yes, I do share that, and I think one of the things, and I live in York, so that's just incidental, but we are actually processing applications for the neighbourhood planning process, and I think one of the concerns I have is that, you know, they are generally from prosperous areas, and so what do you do in terms of embedding neighbourhood planning at a very equitably across deprived areas? One of the best examples is through the big local programme in the 150 areas across England, which is 15 years. Again, this whole theme about time and putting it into the hands of residents. I did want to pick up on what you were saying about leadership and whether it is the responsibility of the private sector. I think I'm sort of slightly ambivalent about who leads it. What it needs is longevity and somebody there, whether it's 5 years or 10 years. And currently in this country, we don't, you know, the private sector can blow with the political wind. It doesn't have to bend with it. Yeah. And I think that's the problem with local authorities. That's the situation we find ourselves in. And on the SETI Growth Commission, one of the panels the other week, we were talking about the comparisons with international examples where cities have that, where they've been there for the real long haul. Probably Manchester is one of the only examples in this country. So, you know, public sector leadership can be there, but we don't see it unilaterally in this country, I don't think.
I'm just going to ask a room a question. I'm intrigued by the answer. If you were forced to choose between the public sector and the private sector in terms of which is better currently at the long term, which would you say? Who thinks the private sector is better at thinking long term? One person, two people. Who thinks the public sector is generally better at thinking long term? Who thinks nobody is good at thinking long term? All right, very good. There we are. I thought you were all asleep, but you're just all miserable. Okay. Adrian, is there anything you've heard that kind of rings alarm bells that you kind of want to alert us to that is still in the debate that you don't think is helpful?
I'm not going to come out in the debate very much, but one of the things I struggle with in this area, and we as a company struggle with, is actually measuring outcomes. And one of my responsibilities has been corporate responsibility and looking at environmental issues and social issues and ethical issues side by side with the business more generally. And it struck me that we're quite good at measuring environmental outcomes. You can go to our website and you will find a lot of data on environmental outcomes of the things we do, mainly around our development program and the buildings that we manage. You will find some data about social outcomes and economic outcomes, but not much and not very reliable, and the metrics are not very clear, and we're working hard to try and get that better. But some kind of common understanding of what those metrics might be. And we talk about numbers of apprenticeships, but that seems to me a very crude measure of outcome. And we talk about employment and GVA, and there are things that we use, but really, I mean, to be frank, we've had an issue over the last week or two defining what we mean by local employment. And you'll find that there's not much mention of local employment in our report, because we've got all sorts of figures on local employment, but no common understanding of what the important figure is. So we've sort of ducked it a little bit. And I don't want to carry on ducking it. I want to get some kind of common agreement on those sorts of things.
And do you think that the determination of what the metrics are, what the success measures are, could be part of the process of engagement? That could be one of the things that emerges from that process, an agreement about what matters.
Yeah, definitely. And that's been the case to some extent on the environmental side. We engage with our occupiers about what's important to them in terms of environmental outcomes. We engage with many more stakeholders on it. We've been much less successful at engaging with people on these sorts of things.
Great. And sometimes it's quite interesting. I mean, I know in the health service, for example, that it turns out that patients care much more about how they're treated than they care about the outcome of or as much about how they're treated as the outcome of the treatment, which is surprising because we measure the latter. So there's something interesting stuff. Christine, finally, before I open it out to them, is there anything that you've kind of heard this afternoon or part of the debate which jarred for you?
Well, I'm still a little bit concerned about local enterprise partnerships, and I mean, we as a trust try to work our way into there, and until I can find out how we as a charity understand how the LEPs are going to work and what we can gain from them, I'm still a bit.
Is it an issue of inconsistency that some are open and others aren't?
Yeah. And I think the jury's out from my perspective as to how I can understand what their role will be and how that will affect the third sector.
Perhaps we need a kind of good LEPs guide book that you can carry around, kind of like a good campaign for real ale or something, campaign for real LEPs. Okay, let me open it out to the room for questions, points, denunciations, rap, I don't know, whatever you want to do. Okay, so we'll start at the back of the room.
My name's Fiona Strelitz. I think the polarity between where the leadership should come from, the public sector or the private sector, is false. I think we generally have a deficiency of imagination, and anyone who takes agency forward positively. I mean, if you take the King's Place building, which I happen to be very intimately involved with its conception of, no local authority could have made that up as a mandate to deliver. It would have been unthinkable. It required an individual and a team's imagination, and it has delivered huge social benefits. And the really exciting thing about King's Place, which I think other people might know as the Guardian building, has been that it has withstood a sale from one owner to another inside of 4 years, and all the community access that the building has enabled has remained intact with ownership to a German pension fund. So it's perfectly possible to set the parameters of really good community benefit with a change of ownership. And then moving on to Regent's Place, which is very much a pivot of today's interest, the tremendous community enablement that gives away and offers is very, very extensive. And a lot of it is quite subtle in operation, such that the different constituencies who are engaged in using Regent's Place are not that focally aware of one another. They don't necessarily engage with one another, but it widens participation in a very plural and active way. And so I think another useful point to make is that we should really stop talking about the community in a kind of static entity. We need to think about community in pluralistic ways, and I think that would be much more productive.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Mike Roberts. I'm one of I'm probably the only declared politician in the room, although I do notice one or two of my colleagues have come in under other guises. That's belatedly as well, by the sound of it. Looking at some of the elephants in the room, which the panel haven't mentioned, I agree with Richard about local government, as I would do, as somebody gets involved at the LGA, and looking at the total of local government and the effect that local governments had to put up with, both governments. I'll be quite blunt about that, being from the red corner myself. But you never mentioned about the Treasury. You know, the worst interfering people that we all have to put up with, I mean all have to put up with, is the Treasury. And it's, you know, talking of one thing, we need to localise what decision-making, but actually centralise. And both governments have been guilty of that as well. So there is a very, you know, a very blunt discussion to have over the next year, I think, with those who represent us on the Treasury Shadow Team or the Treasury itself. And I'll say no more about that. The second issue about another elephant in the room is about community. Community involvement is bottom up. It is not, you know, there's been too many consultants have declared what the community should get rather than what the community should work to develop. A very good example, when I didn't get the chance, Richard, to challenge Lord young Michael Heseltine at the RTPI presentation, is the LDDC, which actually works totally against local communities about what it has come up with. And I think that's a very good lesson for not doing it in that particular way. So I think that is another issue. The third issue, my bête noire, is spatial planning. We don't have any. You know, everybody else in Europe, dare I mention that word, seems to have spatial planning. We have no spatial planning in this country. It's all becoming a complete shambles. And I come from a sub-region of area of local government, and we have no contextual basis upon which we operate together to actually look at some of the issues in that particular area. For those who want to know, it's the Blackwater Valley, and you may know it's Farnborough at one end, Bagshot, Camberley, Aldershot and places like that. So there's nothing that ties us together in planning terms. So we can't actually deal with some of the issues on the ground because we don't deal with it in a sub-regional basis. So those are three issues, I think, which are big elephants in the room that we need to tackle.
Great, three elephants in the room. Other comments, points from the floor before I bring the panel back for final closing comments from them? Yeah.
Hi, it's Graham Randalls from Neff Consulting again. I'd just like to echo Zayona's point that I do think it's a false choice between leadership from the public sector and leadership from the private sector. What we saw when we looked at Regent's Place was that the leadership came from the partnership between the public sector, the private sector, and the third sector being the West Euston Partnership. So I think the more that those partnerships can be formed, the better the leadership can be. And the second point...
But what's the basis for those partnerships? Why is it that some partnerships move beyond being merely transactional or to being genuinely creative in the way that we've heard? What is the ingredient?
I think the key ingredient was the shared vision.
Fine. I hoped you'd say that. Yes.
Good. And just a quick second point, which is to address Adrian's point about measuring outcomes. And again, this is where I think what we call the third sector, the charity sector, has been good at for a long time, is understanding the outcomes, the social outcomes that they're trying to achieve. And I think perhaps it really needs to be starting from the ground up, from stakeholder engagement with the communities, them telling us what those outcomes should be.
Great. I think there was another hand there.
Mark Letchford from DCLG. It's just more, the biggest elephant in the room, I think, is what we mean by socially productive places and how you measure that. I haven't heard that much of discussion around that very fundamental point.
Great. Well, thanks for ending the day with a question which kind of questioned the entire rationale of the day. Could have asked it like 3 hours ago, but okay. So, panel, pick one or 2 points that you want to respond to, and I think it would be good to end the day to give us a sense of what you mean, in essence, by what you understand by a socially productive place. Let's start with you, Alison.
Okay, I seem to have thrown a bit of a grenade in about the ownership, public or private. Okay, if I come to it from the context and talking about that lady from, who's talking about King's Place, just about to leave the room, I think, but my own experience has been around a very place-based, community-driven, and that's how I got into this sector, around a capital build which does perpetuate and it's still thriving 14 years on. But it was very grassroots driven, and I think that one of the things I've learned from these sorts of events is we all come with our own perspectives and our own experiences, so, and that's the value of them. But a lot of the talk today is about how do you manage geographically spread, even if it is in quite a tightly defined but heavily densely populated geographical spread. How do you manage all those factions and tensions and aspirations and so on? And so that, from the British Land Trust example this morning, which I agree is probably exceptional, is you know, how do you continue that momentum? And there are some brilliant local authorities who do it, and there are not so brilliant ones. And that's our experience of working with thousands of community groups across the country. I mentioned big local and local trusts, and if I may just illustrate this, this is a £200 million trust from Big Lottery Fund, their single biggest endowment they've made. Came out in 2010, we bid for and won the work, and we've set up and spun off the local trust. The reason I was excited about it then, as I'm excited about it today, is because it's in these 150 areas who have £1 million to spend. That isn't much money, but it's over 15 years, so we actually have a chance to capture some of these outcomes, and it is a real strong theme. It is resident-led, and so one of the themes that's emerging, the first one is the responses to the financial situation and dealing with access to fair credit. Then the one that's coming along, there are in 3 cohorts, it's really starting to merge, is around employment and enterprise. So there is the opportunity, and the other thing is it gives the opportunity for this longitudinal research. But this place-based approach where residents, the idea of it is to set their visions beyond small projects. So the small projects might be the quick wins, but it is saying, what is it that's stopping your area being socially productive or economically thriving and so on, and really teasing that out with a facilitated approach. What's great is it's independent. It's not private sector and it's not public sector, but it has that longevity, and that's what I'm trying to get at. Our experience, as many people in the room, is things are on a 3-month or a 3-year or a 5-year cycle, and there's no impetus. What we want is that impetus to remain from the community, so it's community driven.
Thank you. Adrian?
I'll quickly come back to that public versus private point as well on leadership. And I think leadership can come from all sorts of different places. And I wouldn't ignore the power of ideas. And I think leadership is often to do with ideas. And actually one of the key players in what we've achieved at Regent's Place was Sir Terry Farrell, who came up with an idea about Euston Road, which changed our perception of Euston Road, changed Camden's perception of Euston Road, I think. And we all saw, actually, this is an important space in London, and something can be done here beyond what the aspirations are now. And we all bought into that. So actually, the leadership, the thought leadership, if you like, which is kind of what this is supposed to be about this afternoon, from my perspective anyway, came from Sir Terry and his team and interacting with other people. Finally, just the socially productive places, what I noted down here, it's a bit like the elephant in the room, you know it when you see it. How you then measure it is the point I was making earlier. This is not easy, but I think we could all go and look at some places and these feel like they're socially productive places. There's a kind of interaction going on between the place and the community. It feels like a healthy place to be. There's a diversity of people in the place. You know, there's a whole range of things that are going on that when we see it, as I say, we know it.
Thank you. Christine?
I agree with the comment over there about the third sector having possibly best placed to identify social outcomes, and we've got a knowledge transfer partnership at the moment with South Bank University looking at our social return on investment, and a range of our construction companies that we're working with are actually very keen to work with us to see how we can get some consensus about what social value is coming out of the work we're doing with them. And your comment about apprenticeships being possibly a simple metric, and it needs to be much more complex on that. So my cry to us all, I suppose, is a consensus to sit down and agree what really matters.
Great. And Richard?
I'm going to take a deep plunge and try and deal with the Treasury, socially productive places and spatial planning in one sentence. The issue about measuring outcomes that Adrian's referred to, we in the RTPI are trying to evaluate planning as an activity from a wider perspective than GDP, and that's research we're undergoing at the moment. One of the questions about the role of the Treasury, which I did kind of hint at, is this notion that you evaluate things simply in terms of, is market failure happening and what regulation do we have to undertake to stop it happening, and then kind of, can we do as little of that as possible? That whole way of thinking is a dominant theology in the Treasury, but there are other ways of thinking. There are other ways of thinking in economics terms, let alone in wider GDP terms. And on spatial planning, I think I believe, and picking up the Mark Priss point, really the way that the areas work together has to be voluntarily. I don't think that we can impose structures which say, you know, area A has to work with area B, and otherwise, you know, nanny state will come and trample on you. what I think is exciting possibility for a future UK government would be to think about what kind of real incentives, going back to Treasury again, can you offer areas to work together. So if you work together, we'll electrify your railway and give you a new station. Or if you work together and demonstrate an enthusiasm for 40,000 new homes in your area, we will give you a fantastic new teaching hospital, and we will bend public spending main programs in a way that rewards cooperation. I think that is a better way than saying, you know, we're going to use the planning inspectorate to bash people over the head because they haven't delivered enough homes.
I heard an example a few weeks ago about in Afghanistan, where they spent an enormous amount of money very unsuccessfully trying to identify villages to invest in terms of infrastructure, and it had been enormously bureaucratic, enormously difficult. And what they did in the end was they simply said, here's a pot of money, and you can have the pot of money if 2 villages can come up with a joint proposal. And all the bureaucracy went. It went entirely, and villages worked together. They came up, and very often they came up with proposals where the investment was all in one of the 2 villages because they just recognised that was the best place to put it. So sometimes very simple ways of incentivising people to work together can be massively better than huge bureaucratic processes. Now, I'm now going to do something which is going to alienate a member of staff from me forever, which is to ask Jonathan, who's in the corner and have no idea I'm going to ask him, where's this work going to go next, Jonathan, from the RSA's perspective? In 30 seconds, you've got to decide by the time the microphone gets to you.
Okay, so we've been taking minutes from each of the sessions, the breakout sessions, the opening and closing. Those are all available and open online. It's then the job of me and my team to turn that into a draft paper, which we're calling policy directions. We're not going to be prescriptive and say these are direct recommendations for, you know, taking one policy out of the national policy planning framework and putting something else in. But they're policy directions that we would hope there'd be a broad consensus from political parties, from local authorities, and from developers to get behind for the next era, thinking about the medium and the long term, which for me means kind of 5-10 years and beyond. So it's a draft paper on policy directions. We will circulate that among some of our experts and speakers today at the end of May, and we'll publish that in early June.
Great, thank you. My definition of a socially productive place is a place which enables people individually and collectively to come up with solutions which help to meet so they can meet their own needs and they can achieve their own aspirations. So it's about enabling people to develop their own solutions for the issues that matter to them. That's what a socially unproductive places are where people feel they're not able to come up with their own solutions. So that's my work. Is that going to sound? Is that satisfactory? You're nodding. That'll do. I'm certain the nodding will do. Okay. Well, look, it's been a really great session. Thanks again to British Land for supporting this event. Thank you to all of you for coming, for participating, and for asking such great questions. And just remains for me to ask you to join me in thanking our panel. Thank you. Oh, and if you fancy a drink, downstairs.